And thank you everyone for coming out. I know it is midterms and we're in a pandemic still. So it's great to see actual human faces in the classroom and to have a real conversation with you guys. So I'm very much looking forward to getting to know you and to sharing a little bit about my work. I have a slide deck. I have an activity for us if we have time. But if we have a lot of questions, we may not get to it, and that's okay. So just know that. Also, I think it's worth saying people do hold degrees in museum exhibition development. And so this is a 1-hour talk, so you're very likely to have lots of questions. And there are also places in this talk where I'll be like, this could be a whole class, or like you could do a degree in this, and we're not going to touch on it for more than a few slides. And that's just like the world we're living in with a seminar. But I encourage you to learn more, and I'll share some resources through Melody with you so you can learn more and do more investigation if that's interesting to you. And just know that like we're never going to be able to go as in depth as we might want, but there are lots of great places and opportunities for you to do that. Maybe some of you will ultimately get museum studies degrees yourselves and come back and teach this class. So just kind of a little caveat there. Also a word about the word exhibit or exhibition. Technically, the whole gallery or the whole installation is the exhibition, and little components are exhibits, but people often throw those terms around pretty interchangeably. So if you're writing a grant, say exhibition. If you're talking to your friends, don't sweat it. So a little bit about me. My current title is I'm a senior science writer. People sometimes also call my role a content developer. I've also done the same work under different job titles like curator or exhibition developer. And in general, what I'm doing when I'm doing this type of job under any name is that I'm trying to do a lot of research and then shape a large body of content into a set of sort of concrete ideas and experiences that people can go and engage with in a physical environment like a museum. So some stuff that I have worked on, You Are Here, California Stories on the Map is actually still up at the Oakland Museum. It got kind of mothballed during the pandemic. So if you're ever there, you can pop by and check it out. It's an exhibition on maps. I also worked on Take Root, Oakland Grows Food, a show about urban gardens, and the Altered State Cannabis in California show, which came out right before the vote in 2016. And I've worked on various projects for the Exploratorium, often sort of for projects that are off-site from the Exploratorium. And I've also done some freelance work for different organizations, but these are things that you are maybe likely to have run across in your local environment. Let's talk about museum environments. So what makes museum environments, I'm gonna move that bar so you can see my top bar, because that's where I put all my slide titles. So let's talk about what makes museums a special place physically, like what's unique about the museum environment physically. So this is a picture of the Louvre. Here's a couple of things to call out. They're social spaces. People come to museums to have a social experience with friends, family, peers, maybe even strangers, depending on the vibe you created. There's also a lot of visitor traffic. So if you're working at a place like the Smithsonian, you're getting upwards of 2 million visitors per year. So everything you make has to withstand that kind of pressure and traffic. People also move through museums crazy fast. So there's a metric we use to study how visitors move through museums called sweep rate, and it's how many square feet per minute a visitor covers. And I think, sweep rates can be anywhere from like 100 to 300 square feet per minute. So people are booking it. If you think about like walking into your kitchen, messing around for a minute and then leaving, like that's kind of how people are using museum spaces. They're really kind of just booking through. So it's helpful to think of that when you're planning exhibitions. A lot of museums have collections, either sort of old hands-on activities or specimens, artwork, and that's an amazing resource. And I think in your work on archives, you're kind of getting a sense of what the sort of archival material can do for you. They're also a controlled environment, so you can direct flow of visitors, you can display stuff that is really fragile and control the environment around it. That's kind of a double-edged sword because sometimes the objects in your care dictate certain environmental needs, like paintings can't be exposed to too much light. Other times it's great because you can create a Yayoi Kusama like mirror room and you have complete control over the environment and it's really cool. So that controlled environment is like a little bit of a pro and a con. And museums have resources. They actually sometimes have money. Museum staff will always tell you how they don't have enough money, and that always really feels true, but there's actually a fair amount of resources in museums to make things and do things. Maybe not as much as you would like, but it's available. Can you let me advance my slide? Okay, and so what makes museums unique cultural spaces? I think your class is thinking about this pretty deeply, and a lot of your other speakers. But just to touch on it briefly, museums hold social relationships with cultural groups. So this is at the National Museum of the American Indian in the Smithsonian. They have a lot of programming relationships with different indigenous cultural groups and projects that come and present. It's a programming space. You can bring people together and have programs. We're not going to talk that much about programming because that's like a whole other job in a museum. And I occasionally interact with programmers, but it's not like my bread and butter. And then it's also really worth remembering that museums have a pretty dark colonial history. So people collected objects and sometimes even people over, in the course of the development of museums as a modern institution. And so it's helpful to remember as a museum worker that, even though I'm a person who loves museums, not everyone's relationship is as uncomplicated and delighted as mine. And so it's helpful to just bear that in mind as you're engaging with collaborators. Again, you could do a whole degree on that topic, but we're just going to kind of acknowledge it today. When you're working on an exhibition, you might have some goals. I think you obviously should have some goals. And here are some example goals that you might have. You might want to help people explore a complex idea. Alternately, you might want to have people develop empathy and engage with other perspectives. These aren't mutually exclusive. You could have more than one goal. You might want to celebrate a community or culture. So these would be, you often see this in ethnically specific museums or museums about a specific type of craft. You might want to contest a history. Museums might be an opportunity to say, like, what you think you know about this topic is actually wrong. It can also be a place to foster a healthy debate. They're kind of museums are a funny third space, like people are out engaging in this sort of unscripted way. And so the hope, I think, of many museum professionals is that we'll be able to get people talking to each other in a way that isn't possible on, say, like Twitter or Facebook or, your Thanksgiving table, if your family is like mine. And there's lots of more exhibition goals, but it's helpful to kind of define them and think about them as you're starting the work of developing an exhibition. This is a big messy slide, but we're going to come back to it. So you're going to see it a few times. So exhibitions take about 3 years to make, sometimes longer, sometimes you can do it shorter, but that's about the average. There's kind of 3 phases that typical museums go through. The Exploratorium has a whole different process. It's a lot more kind of anarchist. People are making stuff and then testing it together, and then kind of the best ideas like bubble up, and you get kind of a constellation of experiences. That's a little unusual. I'd say most museums follow kind of this, something similar to this 3-phase project plan. So the first phase is content development. And so this is to kind of understand the content space and structure and identify the most essential ideas and stories and kind of threads. And this is where you're meeting with community groups. You probably are reading a lot of academic literature. You're going to events and lectures, kind of immersing yourself in the content. The product that comes out of this is, again, this is hiding under the bar here, but a big idea and main messages. And we'll talk about what those are, but they're essentially a framing device for the exhibition. Experience development is where you take those kind of ideas and turn them into experiences, that things people see or do or engage with or reflect on in a gallery. And I have some kind of prompts to help people think about that. And what comes out of the experience development phase, there's also a lot of visitor testing in this phase frequently. What comes out of this is like often a document called an interpretive plan. And it's kind of just a list of all the interactives and objects you're going to use in your exhibition. And then finally, design and production. This is where I actually end up writing labels. Like labels don't actually come until the very end. So the sort of final label text and copy editing happens in this final design and production phase. Designers are really the superstars of the design and production phase, and preparators. So people who are fabricating, they're laying out text. This is the kind of like putting the polish on the exhibition. And the final product of this stage is your exhibition. So this is like the last stage before it goes live. And also I'd include a shadow stage. Ideally, you can leave a little time and budget to remediate. So if you get some stuff installed and you're like, actually, this is not working at all, there's an opportunity to course correct and make things that work a little bit better. On content development and experience development, and I'm mostly going to speak from the content developer sort of exhibit developer place. Actually, I saw a similar talk to this one that was given by my design colleague, and it was totally different. So that's another perspective that you could engage with, but I'm going to just speak to the one that I know best, which is the content development and the exhibit development phase. We're going to talk a little bit first about the content development phase, and we're going to focus most of our time on experience development. But as I said, this is where you're kind of exploring the content. It's also worth mentioning, I guess, before we dive in too deeply, here are some common roles I work with. Good exhibition teams usually have a project manager. They're often engineers or physical interface developers who I'm working with designers, both 2D and 3D. Research and evaluation roles are really important in museums. Not all museums have them, but often people dedicate a staff person to doing visitor feedback or visitor testing. Registrars are the people who are essentially archivists. Maybe some of you are familiar with that term, but if you're not, they're the people who kind of manage collections. They arrange loans. If you're like, I really need to borrow this piece of art from another institution. They'll often help with rights and reproduction if you're doing a reproduced photo or something. And we're often partnering with other institutions. So potentially I'm arranging a loan, for example, from Berkeley. I want to borrow some documents and put them on display. So they're often kind of an additional partner. So as you approach the sort of content development phase, you're kind of trying to answer some of these questions. The first and one of the most important is, what are the key ideas and stories? Like, what do people really need to understand about this topic to sort of become conversant in it or to understand it more fully and to meet your exhibition goals? Another important question is, who are the key thinkers and the interesting practitioners or who are compelling people in this field? Does this field have a few superstar people? Does it have like beloved figures? Does it have hated figures? And so kind of figuring out what the kind of constellation of people and thinkers in this space is. And then how will visitors connect this with their own lives and experiences? So a concern a lot of people had when I was working on maps are like, some people hate maps or some people find navigation to be stressful. And so we wanted to do a little more exploration and see if like, is that true? Do people find maps uncomfortable? Or do people like have a lot of interest in maps? So people are gonna engage with the content based on their lived experience. And it's helpful to try to think a little bit about what that might be. Or for example, a food exhibition, or an agriculture exhibition, you might immediately start with the entry point of like, well, everybody's eating food. So like what, where does that come from? And helping people understand food through the lens of like their diet. I think an important thing to talk about when we're talking about content development is like, what is even content? And content does not have to be formal expertise. I think historically museums really leaned on the scholarly to sort of give themselves a sense of authority. And there's kind of a very narrow idea of what content could be. But content could be so many things. It could be your peer-reviewed research, but it could also be commissioned artworks, community projects, traditional practices. If there's a hot debate happening on a topic, that can be content. Sketch comedy, is it oral history? I think you heard about a couple of great community archives. So there's just a lot here. And so it's really, I think, important to move away from a really narrow definition of content and think really broadly about like, what are ways people might engage with this material? I think another thing to think about the museum role, I think historically curator was sort of like treated as a knowledge giving role, like you hold all the ideas and you kind of then share and structure them with the world. And I think more and more people are thinking of like partner and content experience as being the sort of what people are coming to see. So you're coming to see people's artwork or people's music or a documentary someone made. And that what the museum then brings to the table is museum-specific skills and resources that help those groups or organizations put their work in a gallery setting successfully. So like a lot of what I'm doing is like, this is a cool idea you have. Let's make it robust to 2 million visitors. Like, how can we make this in a way that like 2 million people can touch it? So I think about like, sort of like what can museums bring to the table effectively? And I think it's this sort of like making the museum environment work for other groups. How we put that together, it can be magic. Another thing you'll probably want to do at the beginning of a content development phase, or maybe partway through as you're getting to know people, is you'll probably want to assemble an advisory group. These are people to help you kind of guide your thinking and provide their perspective about this content. And this could be something kind of small and intimate, like if you're working on a specific arts or cultural movement, you might pick just a few people who are really involved in that movement. When I worked on maps, I wanted sort of just a big festival of ideas. Everyone who has different ideas about maps, I wanted them to come and share and have a dialogue with each other. And interestingly, this is how I know Susan. When I asked people who should I invite to our maps event, which we called Mappy Hour, everyone was like, you should invite Susan Moppet, she's so great. And so then Susan came and it was great. And that's how I met you, is through your participation as one of our advisors. And it was fantastic. In assembling an advisory group, again, you want to get out of that scholarly perspective and certainly not lean on it exclusively. So we had scholars and other curators and researchers and journalists at our Mappy Hour, but we also had practitioners, so people who are making maps for a living, urban planners who rely on maps. And then we really wanted people with specific lived experience around maps. So people who are doing education advocacy, using sort of school district and redlining maps to advocate for specific changes, or very specialized map making. We worked with Lighthouse for the blind and visually impaired. They make a whole series of really cool Braille maps on everything from the BART system to the Burning Man Playa. They have like this cool, like, method for making these tactile maps. And so we had them come too. And we, basically just had a big party. And again, your advisory group might look very different depending on the goals of your exhibition and the sort of like intimacy of the content versus the sort of broader perspective on the content. Also in this stage, as you're doing this research, it's really helpful to get some front-end evaluation or audience research. And again, you can get a whole degree in this, so I'm not going to say that much about it. I'll leave that for more professionals who are more versed in it. But you can sort of see, what do people know about this topic? People have sort of an allergic reaction to certain aspects of this topic. They're like, this is terrible. Or even just really simple things like, is your audience bilingual and would they prefer to use bilingual labels? So it can help you to define both practical things as well as just sort of understanding how your audience, what their kind of preconceived ideas about content are. With this sort of like ingestion of all this content, what you're ultimately trying to get to are kind of two products. One, I usually write a content brief, and most people do, and it's essentially just a literature review and summary of like kind of all the things that you've learned and done. But the thing that's going to guide your exhibition development work most is the big idea and main messages. A big idea is just like it's kind of like a thesis statement for the show. If like a way to think about a successful big idea is if someone walks up to a visitor and was like, hey, what's this exhibition about? They would say something similar to your big idea. And then main messages are the same, but they're kind of for subsections of the show. So they're like a little bit more specific and defined. And I have 3 examples of big ideas here. So the Sand Ocean Hall, the National Museum of Natural History, has the big idea: the ocean is a global system essential to all life, including yours. So they're obviously going for that personal connection. When I worked on maps, the big idea we had was maps are tools for sharing ideas, information, or aspirations about a place. And then the Monterey Bay Aquarium's Sharks Gallery, I think it may have been updated since this was a big idea, but this is the classic big idea that's taught in schools. It's sharks are not what you think. And so they're looking for, I think that's an example of challenging the narrative. Sharks, not just eating you, they're doing all kinds of other things. I think the big idea is good because it tells you what your exhibition is about. It can also tell you what it's not about. So it gives you kind of permission to say no to stuff that's like really cool, but isn't quite a fit. And that's also, I think, really important as you're shaping things. This can also be a great time to pressure test your content with your advisor. So we took an early version of our big ideas and main messages and asked people to mark them up at Mappy Hour. And they give us lots of great feedback on how we could rethink some of these things, and they kind of elevated certain stories, like particularly stories about maps and objectivity. People have, I think, a real myth about maps being super objective as a form, and like, not any more than any other form of cultural production. So once you have your big idea and main messages, we're going to move into the experience development phase. And so this is where you're kind of translating those ideas into to like actual experiences in the gallery. And I have some question prompts that I use to get my own thinking started. This is certainly not an exhaustive list of approaches, but it's just sort of my little cheat sheet for myself, which now you have. First question, how is this taught in a classroom or program? So museums, you know, high traffic, not a lot of facilitation. So they're very different from a classroom, but we can learn a lot from how classrooms handle different types of content. So on the left, we have an additive color exhibit, looking at light mixing. On the right, pendulums. You can see how this could easily become a hands-on experience in the gallery. And the center, when I was working on maps, we looked at a lot of classroom activities around helping kids map. And so we kind of wanted to develop something similar to that for the gallery. And we wanted to think about ways we could do it so that people didn't need the support of a teacher. I'll walk you through a little bit about how that particular piece got developed. So an important piece of exhibition development is often prototyping if you're making an interactive component. So this is our intern Ashling, who is testing some ideas here. So we asked people to make a map of their Oakland, Oakland from their perspective. And we did a lot of different things to see what would work for them and what would help them engage with this unfacilitated. So like, how big is the base map? Is there color on the base map? Like, what are the prompts we're giving people to help them write, you know, to help them develop their map? Should they have colored pencils and stickers or just colored pencils? Like, how are people using the different components? And so you can see people did make maps. We had a lot of really cool ones. A lot of people did sort of nature and parks. One person made later when we installed it in the gallery, a map of all the places the Matrix was filmed in Oakland, and they used Keanu Reeves' face as the like icon for the filming locations. So people had a lot of really fun and creative approaches. And so what we were able to come up with is that colored pencils only was the way to go. A base map that worked best was one that had like a little slice of San Francisco, most of the East Bay. And then we looked at a lot of things like, how could a person hang their map? Like, is this clip workable for someone who has like low dexterity in their hands? Like, can you hang your map even if your hands aren't don't have the full range of motion? And we actually ended up having a pretty good, this was a pretty successful interactive in this show. Another question prompt that I use for myself are, what are the research methods or tools that researchers use to understand this idea? So over here, we have a Stroop Effect exhibit at the Exploratorium, and maybe you've seen this on the internet. It's where there's words, but they're printed in a color that is in contrast with the text. And most people, when they engage with this sort of test, it's actually really hard to not read the text and to actually repeat the color that the word is printed in. People really attune to the text. So this is like a psych research tool that was pretty directly translatable into an exhibit. Again, like microscopes, other types of investigation, like physical investigation tools can be productive. And then many of you, I think, are urban planners or training to be urban planners. And so if you're doing an urban planning charrette, you might use dot maps to have people kind of apply dots to indicate where they want different amenities in their community. And I was like, this is a modality that I think we could use in the gallery. And we ended up making this exhibit. And I always say finalish because I want to always leave the like opportunity for remediation. Like, it's never really done, but it's installed and that's like, it's working. So it's going to probably stay in its current form for a little bit anyway. And so this is we had a prompt, where is Oakland loud and where is Oakland quiet, with 2 colored stickers. People kind of were building a heat map of like where sound is happening in Oakland. Another question is, could a visitor experience this phenomena directly? So again, that light mixing one, you're mixing the light yourself. So here's a couple of examples of that. This is a Bernoulli blower. I don't know if anyone's ever done physics, but still air and moving air have different pressures. So you can do kind of cool tricks with the ball when there's air coming out of a tube. This is a perfume exhibit at the Museum of Design. They did a lot of work to help people smell and engage with perfumes and perfume components. This is something I worked on at AMCA around bee buzzing. So bees often buzz at different frequencies when they're pollinating. So I had a bee sound and an instrument playing the same tone. So you could kind of compare them. And then it's helpful to remember that a phenomena need not be a physical phenomena. It can be like a social or psychological phenomena. So This isn't an actual example of the Tech Museum's interactive, but they had a great would you rather interactive about data privacy. Like, so would you rather everyone see your financial information or all the photos on your phone? And then you have to kind of sit with the discomfort around that question, and your personal reaction to that question is then the phenomena. Visitors, I think, as we talked about, like, we want people to kind of engage personally with the content. And I think I heard that in some of the comments that Melody made. It's about like, what are visitors bringing to this narrative already? Like, what is sort of what is the scaffolding that they're arriving with? And so, an important way to engage them is to kind of hear from them and to help them kind of reflect on their own experiences. So we have the Happy exhibit by Sagmeister and Sagmeister. This is kind of often a famous example for design. And so people rate how happy they are and take a ball from the dispenser that reflects their happiness. And you kind of see a distribution of how people are feeling. This is a Future City exhibition at the City Museum of New York. And it's just the prompt is what if. So what if the metro stopped running at midnight? What if we had free parking? All these kinds of like, and then people kind of respond to the card and say like, that would be terrible, or that would be awesome, or we would need to do this. Anka has its participatory timeline, so you can add kind of personal events or events that you remember to this bigger timeline of history. And the museum has these sorts of votes that they change out pretty frequently about different types of journalistic ethics questions. So those are different ways of engaging with people. I think my PSA for this one is like, not everyone is super verbal. Not everyone has the physical dexterity to write with a pen. Some people are just there with a big group or small kids. So I always try to find ways to engage that aren't exclusively about writing, although writing can be a great tool for getting people to reflect. And last but not least, or not second to last but not least, this is like the real museum-y part of the talk. So objects, artifacts, or documents and how they're used to tell a story. So I have a couple of examples here about objects that are just really powerful and help people engage with the story in a meaningful way. So Smartha, the last passenger pigeon, the National Museum of Natural History, obviously a powerful object that tells a story about extinction. When I was working on maps, an important idea that I really wanted to express is that maps can be a tool for personal expression. And so Omar Mizmar makes these sort of very personal maps where he like picks a dude on Grindr and follows them through the city and then makes a map about that experience. And they never meet. It's just about his like experience of like longing. And so that's like one of the most personal maps you can have. So we felt like that that artwork really told the story of maps being personal tools for expression. And then this is a piece that I saw, or an object that I saw in an exhibit called Dalit, A Quest for Dignity, which is the Dalit are a sort of marginalized group in India and Nepal. And this is a contract that's actually two contracts in one. The contract written in the main part is sort of a relatively favorable lending contract for somebody. The left-hand bit is a relatively favorable, right-hand bit is the relatively favorable contract. And the middle bit is as a much less favorable contract. And so if a person misses a payment, the favorable contract is lopped off and only the unfavorable one remains. So it's an actual physical tool for structurally oppressed. Like there's structural oppression that's very visible in this document. And I thought this was a better way of telling that story than really almost anything, because you could just see how precarious this person's financial situation was made by this tool. And then, like, I think another really important question is, who is amazing or essential at telling the story? Like, you know, I'm a white curator, and so some stories are just really not mine to tell. And I think more and more people really feel like the best possible experience is someone telling their own story, and that visitors will respond best to that. And the communities you work with will also have the best possible experience with that. So just kind of finding people who can tell their own story and then providing the structure and the means to do that in the museum is a big part of what you're doing as a curator. So this is an example of an artwork that kind of does that by Chris Johnson. It's called Question Bridge. And it's just Black men asking other Black men questions and then answering them just about their lived experience. And it's, you know, very profound things and sort of silly things. And it's just a really lovely piece of art that couldn't be made, you know, by anyone else. And it's certainly, like, it tells a story in a way that I think nothing else could. Over here, we have some shots from a documentary that I worked on for Take Root. And it's just a documentary about urban gardeners. So we just had a kind of like 2-minute deep dive into 6 urban gardens, and people talked about their motivation and what they grow and what challenges they face. And again, like, it's much more powerful than anything anyone could say in a label, to hear people just share their own perspective. It's helpful to think about how and how much you're going to involve people from the community in your exhibition. And this is like a very, I'd say shouldn't be the cutting edge of museum practice, but it is a thing that people struggle with in museum work. And there's lots of different ways to think about it. A common sort of framing that people have adopted really widely is from a document called the Mass Action Toolkit. And it stands for Museums as Sites for Social Action. And they have kind of a guideline or framework for engaging with communities. And they kind of offer like 3 levels that you might use to engage communities. And the first is contribution. So people can just kind of like, you're like, I would like a drawing from 17 fifth graders. I'd like a pair of shoes that 25 people wore to prom. And this is kind of the shallowest version of engagement. And I think like we want to obviously move beyond this, but there are times when the contribution is like the right way to go if you're just trying to tell a story about a really broad range of people. Collaboration is sort of the next level up in terms of investment. And this is like community members and museum staff working together on a component or a gallery section. And the community kind of has ownership of that component or space. And I have examples of what these all look like in practice as well. So it's a little bit more involved. Again, this is often a paid relationship. You're kind of giving people an honorarium or paying them as advisors in an hourly way. This is kind of like an intermediate one. I think it's pretty doable for a lot of museums. And then co-creation, people often talk about it as the holy grail. I think it doesn't happen enough, and people really want to elevate it and advocate for this type of work with museums. And this is essentially taking on like a colleagueship with some group of people or person. It's often like paid in a salaried way or in like sort of as a part-time role. You're essentially co-curating with somebody else. And it also, of course, requires the museum and the museum staff to cede quite a bit of power and decision-making ability to your collaborators. And I think this is like I think one of the most impressive and like the most important things we could be working on. But it is quite a bit more of a lift for museums because you're essentially hiring somebody and you're involving them in the processes and workings of your institution and kind of onboarding them. So it doesn't happen as often as it should, but I think more and more people are pushing to do this kind of work. I have a few examples of what these look like. So we're that kind of atlas of Oakland that we talked about with the drawing exhibition or the drawing exhibit. We wanted to source a bunch of different maps from people across Oakland, sharing their ideas about what Oakland is to them. And you can kind of see the Atlas of Oakland kind of installed over here. We had 7 maps made by different community members with sort of different perspectives and backgrounds, the orientations to map making. So again, in Mappy Hour, we met with a lot of really cool people. So that was a great way to find map contributors. And in our work with Lighthouse for the blind and visually impaired, we're like, a tactile map could be a really cool way to show a different type of mapping for visitors. So we contacted Lighthouse for the blind and visually impaired, and they were like, oh yeah, our technology instructor Amy just moved to Oakland and she really wants to make a map of her new neighborhood. And so she made this really cool tactile map for us where she has Braille and like lots of like cool tactile things like a pipe cleaner and sticky dots and stuff like that. And we have this on display and then also a more touchable version so that it doesn't like get loved to death. So that was like an example of contribution. We kind of had our network, we reached out to people gave us maps. Some of them were really awesome. It worked out in a pretty straightforward way. When I was working on Altered State, we undertook a collaboration with some youth educators who do sort of youth peer education around substance use. And in this case, we kind of treated them like clients. So we met with them and we'd be like, do you like this concept? What do you think about this concept? And then we would kind of give them different design packages. We'd be like, do you like the walls in this color? Do you like this framing? Do you like this style? And we kind of just treated them like clients. And so they made a lot of design decisions. They wrote quite a lot of the label text and provided a lot of imagery for us. But they were in one section of the greater exhibit. Like they didn't help us decide the exhibit title. They didn't help us decide, what kind of programs to have. They had control over a relatively limited section it was one of 10 sections in the exhibition. And so that's maybe more of an example of a collaboration. And then co-curation or co-creation, I don't actually have an exhibit example of this from my work, but I worked on a program development project for this project called Celebrate Urban Birds, and it's about a citizen science bird activity, and it was also designed to have like an arts component to go with it. And we were working with an organization called Outdoor Afro. They do sort of programming for Black families in Oakland in the outdoor space. They're really great. And we wanted to really kind of approach the design process as full co-equals. And so we hired a facilitator, this dude named Ashanti Branch, and he ran the whole design thinking workshop for us. And so we all kind of just showed up with like half museum staff, half Outdoor Afro staff, and kind of work together to design and make a program. And so that, I think that can be a tool, is either to kind of hire someone on as your colleague if you're doing a long-term, or if it's something else, you can maybe hire someone to lead the process, and the museum can step out of the kind of leadership role for projects or for elements of the project. And yeah, so we did like a lot of design sprints with them, and then tested the activity at the Friday nights dance party at the Oakland Museum. So we had a chance to kind of to see how it worked, and for everyone to kind of see how their ideas played out, and then kind of adapt and refine together. So it's a smaller a program and not an exhibition, but that's an example of like how a co-creation could look. Last but not least is the design and production stage. And again, I'm not going to talk quite as much about this because really the designers kind of lead the dance in this phase. And so this is where people are selecting fonts, colors, materials, and kind of a lot of things are getting built. I'm writing final label text and getting that edited, copy edited, and reviewed by various people. Particularly if you're writing label text about somebody or about a project, it's helpful to have, you know, eyes from someone who you're working with on that text. So this is kind of like this is almost like if you're doing a play, this is where like the final production push is going, like you're fitting the costumes, you're setting up the lights and all this stuff. It's like your dress rehearsal almost. And here are some examples of what design products would look like in this stage. So this is from my colleague Emily at the Exploratorium. This is a rendering of a gallery that she worked on in South America, in Brazil, for a client project that we were working on. And here's a kind of another high level view for another project in Omaha. So this is a 3D render from above, so you can see the floor plan in 3D. This is a project I worked with at the United States Botanic Garden with their designer, and this is sort of an exhibit level or an interactive level rendering for a microscope interactive. So you can see it's just kind of mapping out like table height, and can like a wheelchair get under the table, and like how many scopes are, you know, going to fit on the table, and what is it going to look like, and how high are the graphics going to be, and, you know, what will that look like, you know, all in context. So this is where the kind of like details, and, you know, it's easy to think details aren't important, but these are the details that make user experience really functional. These are where they kind of get ironed out. So at the end of it, you have an exhibition. This is my buddy and his kid looking at Take Root. And you can just sort of take some time to remediate. It's helpful to have evaluation take place after you've installed. And keep some money and time and staff hours in reserve to fix any problems that come up. And then at that point, you're live, and you're able to sort of step back and let the exhibition live in the world. So that is sort of the bulk of my talk. I want to leave time for questions. And how are we on time, Melody?
We're great. We have 30 minutes left.
Oh, okay. So I can do questions. I can also do an activity if you guys are interested in that. Would you like to do questions first? Yeah.
I guess what's your process for coming up with the idea initially? I guess I'm wondering, do you put out feelers for people to suggest topics? And what does that look like?
Some museums do that, definitely. But I think typically often it's the most common scenario is that your institution has ideas about what needs to be done. So for example, the Altered State Show is not one that I proposed, but the institution really wanted to engage with that political moment around a vote. So I'd say probably like 3/4 of exhibitions are often kind of, they're not necessarily coming with a mandate from above, but there's like a sense that the institution needs to work on something. And different institutions have different cultures around how you propose exhibitions, who proposes exhibitions. I think it's sort of rare as an exhibition developer to get to fully outright pick your topic.
I ask is because I'm wondering about which stories get told, and who's dictating which stories.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I've ever like proposed from soup to nuts was maps. And that was sort of at a time when I was like pre-pandemic. So I was worried about like, or was feeling like there was a lot of difficulty. People were having difficulty in engaging with data in a healthy way. People are either kind of like cherry picking it or like distrusted data just as a practice. And so that's where that kind of came from for me. But in terms of, where do exhibit ideas come from and how do stories get told? Different institutions have different processes, but it's very often like coming from either from leadership or ideas sourced from the public or from staff, then filtered through leadership. And it's worth saying, like, I proposed maps probably maybe a couple months after I came on board. And it took a long time for me to kind of walk it through the different exhibit approval process steps and to like help people see like that it could have a social justice element to it, that it could have, an appropriately youth-focused element to it. So even when people propose ideas, there's often like a vetting process that they go through. So I'd say that's another piece of it too. There's idea generation and then idea filtering as well. Our partner is asking for a specific prompt because they want to hear from the audience.
Yeah.
I think that's relatively uncommon. And I think the reason, and I wouldn't necessarily encourage a partner to rely on a visitor response wall to really inform what they're doing. People say really silly stuff. You have to like weed it. It's an important element of visitor responses is you just have to weed out the like inappropriate stuff. And they're also not like independent samples. Like a family will write something together or a couple will write something together. And so they're not like true data collection components. So that isn't something that's come up a lot. And I don't know that I would, we might like source, talk to our collaborators about what prompts they think will engage people, but I would never want them to rely on visitor response interactives as like a meaningful source of data. Yes.
Exhibition information takes like 3 years or so. So is like the idea of like generating those ideas a part of the 3 years, or is that kind of like?
It can be, but I think that kind of happens before the 3-year clock starts. And there's variation. This process can shrink or expand depending on the needs of the project. But I'd say that the 3-year clock kind of starts once you're like, all right, we're doing an exhibition. It's on architecture, and this is how it's going to be. We've got someone in the back.
Thank you so much. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about money and the distribution of resources, especially also in relationship to the 2 arrows that we have, depth and facility. They sort of counter each other's movement, which made me really wonder, like, what does inclusivity even mean if there's no resources or like distribution?
Yeah, I think I wouldn't necessarily say that there's a financial layer that maps specifically onto the, it doesn't necessarily have to map specifically onto the depth and include the depth, the 3 sort of levels from the mass action framing. And I'll pop back so we can look at that slide. So I think certainly co-creation, if you want to fully staff it with a co-curator, does take a little bit more money. But you can imagine a contribution, experience where you source handmade pottery from all over California, and then you're shipping it and handling it and installing it with mounts and cases. So one needn't necessarily be more expensive than the other. Like you could certainly have a very expensive contribution or a more affordable co-creation. And yeah, I think resource limitation is often just, I think, a frustrating and difficult element of exhibition development. I always feel like my job as an exhibition developer is to advocate for my collaborators and also for the visitors. So what is going to honor their stories and what are the resources I need to get to honor their stories and to tell those stories in the best possible way and in the way that they feel is most appropriate to their work. And then also I want things that work for visitors. Like I want, things that are going to be accessible for people and that are easy to use and that are nice materials and that are engaging and offer them kind of a meaningful and rich experience in the gallery. So I feel like that's often what you're doing. It's just sort of like fighting to get the resources so that you can do this type of work in the way that you think it really needs to be done. Yes?
Kind of building off of what you just said, like how you're advocating for visitors. I was wondering if, I'm gonna miss the question, but I'm thinking of like who is able to attend museums and what ways and what background they come from. And I was wondering like how you incorporate, like who is your visitor, like how, and like how you plan for that and how you like tell their story or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think ideally, I think a sort of unfortunate fact about museums in the US and I think worldwide today is that they tend to skew pretty white. They tend to skew pretty, middle to upper middle class. And that varies from institution. Like AMCA has done a relatively good job of developing sort of a diverse visitor base. But that is, it definitely doesn't fully reflect the population of Oakland. Museums do a lot of different things to sort of try to bring in people that are outside their sort of core audience. So, there'll be like programming events or sort of relationships with community groups where you're kind of trying to invite people in and create a programming experience that feels like a good invitation for them. In the case of a exhibition, I think one of the important things, to speak from and a lot of what you're talking about is at institutional level. So there's audience development people and audience research people who are collecting that data and kind of thinking about that data. As a exhibit developer, a couple of things come to mind. One is just because people aren't coming to your museum yet, doesn't mean you shouldn't build for them. So if you think like there's actually a big bilingual population in Oakland, but they're not coming to our museum, the answer isn't like no bilingual labels. The answer is like maybe make space for bilingual labels and then try to do more outreach to those communities. I think also your partners in developing exhibitions can be powerful ambassadors for your institution. So you can, if you have a good relationship with different organizations, you can, again, sort of issue that invitation through them. Like we're having a chat with the staff, or we're having free tickets for you to come to our Friday nights event, so that they can be sort of a powerful way to reach the community. And yeah, I think that like just sort of recognizing that there's a gap between who museums are currently serving and who they want to serve, and thinking about ways to kind of bridge that gap. I think no single exhibit can do that, but your exhibit should have that as a goal in mind. I think put a hand and I'll do.
It seems like so much work and a lot of time goes into producing exhibitions.
Yes.
How long are they usually up for, and does that feel like with less of time for you, or do you wish there were ways to extend the length of exhibition? Yes, general, curious.
Yeah, people ask about that sometimes. And I actually like the idea of exhibitions turning over relatively quickly, even if things I've worked on come down fairly soon. Just because I think museums need to respond to the moment as much as they can. Typical exhibition really depends. Things I'm working on for the Exploratorium are kind of permanent galleries for clients sometimes. And so those will be up for maybe half a decade. And so that's quite a long time. I think Maps is scheduled to be up for 2 years, and that feels that feels generous to me because I think we have a lot of interesting content that could also be in that space. So I think, yeah, 2 years feels like it feels like a decent and generous amount. Altered State was up, I think, only for about 6 months, but it was, designed to sort of support people in conversation prior to voting on legalization. And so that, I think it served its purpose, even though it came down relatively quickly. And maybe there's a new conversation that needs to happen in that space. So yeah, I feel like it's good to just let it go. Yes?
I'm curious for you, what brings you like joy and satisfaction from after an exhibit that you've developed up, people interact with it, and then same question, but you as a museum,
Oh, that's a good question. So I think watching people use interactives and like have conversations with each other is like my greatest source of joy. And also when your exhibit partners come through and they see, like their work, and if they are happy with it, ideally, that's also a really nice moment. That feels like, everything went well. And then, yeah, as a museum exhibit attendee, I sort of think working in museums like a little bit ruins you. I feel like I kind of I'm often like trying to I'm like, oh, how did they do it? Or like, what was their methodology? Or did they test this? But I really like my favorite sort of format of exhibit is the direct experience. And I also really love scent exhibits. I think scent exhibits are just the coolest thing ever. So I like anything that like directly puts me in contact with the phenomena. At least that's what I'm excited about right now.
Follow-up question. So what is success looks like? Like what is the measure? Is that traffic, the number of people who come to see it, or who cares about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And museums with robust evaluation departments can give you great insight into how your exhibition is performing. Traffic is a key metric. Museums have resources, but a lot of them do really rely on visitor ticket sales. So, if you're supporting the sort of general mission of your institution by getting people in the door. But then there's also often evaluation questions like, did people come away with an understanding of the big idea or an understanding of the comment? The content, did they have like sort of social experiences in the gallery? And often there'll be like a sort of a survey team that goes out and surveys people over some period of time after you've opened. And you can kind of get a sense of like, are people taking away what you hope they would? Are they having social experiences? Do they feel like their experiences and ideas are reflected in the gallery? So I think evaluation can really help you get that insight. In terms of the metric of success, I think that's something you kind of have to define with your institution. Is it really just about like making money? Like, if you're the Color Factory or like the Museum of Ice Cream, like you're just kind of there to like give people a fun social good time. And if you're doing something else, like maybe you have a different thing you want to evaluate. You were the next, yes? Okay.
Yeah, thank you. I was curious about the slide about the Botanic Gardens that you worked on.
Oh yeah.
And I was wondering about if you consider like the outdoor Botanic Garden itself to be a museum, or if like the museum part is kind of like indoor exhibits.
Oh, this is a whole topic. Like Botanic Gardens are kind of like a museum adjacent crazy experience, and they work with a really different set of constraints. In this case, I was working on a gallery that was in a botanic garden in a climate controlled-ish area. But yeah, I'd say that like a lot of the interpretive strategies that you're using in museums can work well in like sort of botanic gardens, and I'd add like nature centers into that bucket as well. But there's also, again, you're losing that climate control piece in that space, so you can't like hang a painting necessarily, or things are exposed to the elements. So I think there's definitely an adjacent skill set that comes from nature centers and botanic gardens.
So just a quick follow-up. So like the San Francisco Botanic Garden, really cool. And then, I was wondering if you consider that to be a museum or maybe like a living museum. I was just kind of curious on how to find that.
I mean, I think it's sort of how the institution frames it for themselves. Like the United States Botanic Garden is a part of the American Association of Museums, so they see themselves as a museum. I think maybe the most important thing to think about when rather than like how your institution is defined, is sort of like, what are its best assets and what are like the highest and best use of those assets. So the San Francisco Botanic Garden is beautiful. It's located in the city. You have both city views and nature views. You have this large collection of plants. And so rather than like trying to put a label on it, man, I think you can get a lot out of just being like, what are the best experiences that this place has to offer? And like, how do I elevate those or like scaffold them so people, stop and take time to notice. So I think that there's a lot of, I think it's more about just kind of like understanding what your institution does best and then like kind of elevating that and emphasizing that.
Two questions. The first is, I thought your metrics for sweep rate were really interesting and went something very slow museum goer. And I was wondering what you think the relationship between the goals of the exhibition or a specific exhibit are and the sweep rate that you might be trying to achieve, and how you use either the flow of the space or the experiences to try to slow people down or not. And the second is, I was wondering if you what your thoughts were about the transition to virtual or online museums that have been brought on, how that affects your work.
Yeah, so the first question is in some ways a little easier to answer. So I think in general, you want sweep rate to be as low, not as low as possible, but a low sweep rate is generally considered good. But I think it's not entirely up to your exhibition how sweep rate is going to go. So big places and places in big tourist centers have fast sweep rates. Like if you're on the mall in DC, like people are trying to see 3 museums in a day, they are tired, they have 3 kids, and they kind of have this like, you know, it's almost like peak bagging in nature. They're like, I want to see the Hope Diamond and I want to see the like Apollo 13 rocket, and they want to just kind of go around and see all the best things. And so it just would be really hard to push the sweep rate down in a context like that. So I think it's important, like if your museum exhibit is evaluated and you have a sweep rate that you don't love, it may not just entirely be due to your design. But I think what you're saying is that, you know, your point about slowing people down is a really positive one. I think social experiences where people are encouraged to stop and have a conversation are good at slowing people down. Weirdly, big cases of tiny objects slow people down because people are like, what's this rock? What's this rock? And then, yeah, there's a few other things you can do, sort of like, as you mentioned, like sight lines, so that you're not like, if you go into the Exploratorium floor, it's almost like a circus of exciting ideas and experiences. And if you wanted to have a more meditative experience, you might work with sight lines to create, you know, so that people are encouraged to stay. And then also seating, like give people some places to sit, and that really will help with sweep rate. And there's another metric that's often kind of used for individual interactives or exhibits, and that's called dwell time. And it's just like, how long are people staying there? So those are the kind of core metrics. And there's a great paper by sort of the grand dame of museum exhibition development, Beverly Sorrell. She has a number of these kind of big meta-analyses of different institutions and what makes, you know, what their sweep rates are and how that looks. And she's kind of analyzed it. Susan?
Good question. You know, one of your first slides was about museum as a controlled environment. So interesting to me, because when we did our work creating an exhibition that felt involved was the definition of
Of any environment, it's so uncontrolled.
Yeah, and so I'm just curious when you talk about co-creation between a partner and a museum. What's the farthest you've seen a museum or museum-like environment push the envelope on letting the visitor to create, you know, the table and the colored pencils, or it's like you're invited to do something at this point, but not to like radically alter the whole thing. I'm just curious, have there been exhibitions that
Had like a strong visitor co-creation? That's such a good question. And I think like, you know, museums, I think it's almost like galleries and places that do like participatory, like social practice art are the places that are like pushing that the farthest. And I don't actually have a great example of what, like who I think is doing that well, but yeah, I think it's actually almost happening like outside the museum space in these sort of social practice art projects. But I'll have to go try to find some good examples. Yes?
Sorry, I have another question. I was just wondering about your acknowledgement at the beginning about the colonial history of the museum, and I was wondering if you could sort of pull that acknowledgement through your presentation in terms of how this acknowledgement and this recognition of the colonial history of the museum actually shapes museum practices today. And potentially linked to that, I was also wondering what you deem currently the measures of accessibility that are already sort of normalized and standard. So like thinking about, for example, audio description when it comes to visual art, where these are already like sort of part of the standards, so to say, and like what you would think are the things that are being pushed for at this moment that you find interesting or exciting.
Yeah, I think to sort of kind of maybe take your question in 2 parts. The first part in terms of like sort of how does trying to be anti-colonial show up in different stages of the production. I actually have a paper that I'll try to pull and send out with you guys. But I think that there's, you know, so to kind of walk through it, there's pieces around what sources are you using, who are you reading, what is kind of their history and their intellectual sort of orientation. Are you working with people who, and I think to think about this in terms of like colonialism writ broadly, not just in terms of like the museum itself as an environment, but just sort of like, how does like colonialism and racism show up in our society broadly, and how are you sort of working to root that out in your exhibition development practice? So I think that a lot of it has to do not just with the history of museums, but just sort of our history generally as a culture. So I'd say, who are you reading? Who are you working with? And who are, what kind of events are you attending? Trying to kind of like retune if you come from sort of an intellectual, like an academic training, like kind of reorienting your palette around like sort of community practice and seeing community art, and like maybe not looking for sort of like polish or scholarly language when you're like searching for sources. So just being very democratic and actually trying to elevate sources and scholars and thinkers or practitioners who are not from sort of like dominant backgrounds. And then I think the advisory group is another place where that can come in. So you're trying to not work just with scholars, but again, people with lived experience, practitioners. This is a great place to kind of invite those perspectives in and really hear them. I think there's also a version of this where you kind of like pay lip service to it and you're like, thanks everybody, good meeting. And really circling back with them and maintaining those relationships. And so if you're writing a label, you're like, I'm working on this redlining map and you're an education activist who's using this in your work. Like, what would you say in this label? Like what's missing here? So I think that's a piece of it. And then selection of partners and selection of artworks and objects is another another place where that happens. And then design, I think, can have a powerful impact. So one of my designer friends at AMCA used to always try to choose a font that was produced by a type foundry that sort of matched the ethnicity or the sort of cultural orientation of the show. So for Days of the Dead, finding a Latinx type designer, or for she worked on All Power to the People, so finding a Black typographer to make and using those fonts. So just sort of choosing products that are made by the people who you're, choosing vendors and makers who are not just all white. So I'd say those are some touch points. I'm sure there's probably more we could come up with, but I think just sort of being mindful as a consumer, both of information and of materials. And then in terms of what are some practices that kind of are normalized, or what are kind of metrics that are normalized, I think, again, that's where that visitor research piece can be really helpful. So I'm gonna hop back to the question slide. So I think that you're looking to see, like, are people coming to your exhibit, and do they sort of roughly match the demographics of the place where you're working, or ideally even perhaps inviting in people who've not participated in museums as fully. So looking at that and just seeing, are they reporting good experiences in the same way that your white visitors are? So are people like also enjoying it, also finding themselves met, also finding that they were able to even just do basic things like, was wayfinding working for everybody? And I think you kind of alluded to disability and sort of how to build for disability. And I think there's quite a lot of scholarship and thinking about this from like, say, the National Park Service has a very good accessibility guide that I often kind of default to. So I think there's quite a lot of thinking about that comes not just from the museum world, but just comes from like the world of inclusive design. So it's helpful to consider that when you're doing the sort of design phases of the work. Yes.
You talked about like different goals of exhibitions, how they foster healthier space, help people explore complex ideas, whatnot. I'm interested in how the museum space can actually foster for people. So you did mention how you might value the fact that people are able to have direct contact with the phenomenon for museums, but I wanted to hear more about what you think are factors that, I guess, differentiates museums from like different means of experience or information. So for instance, how are exhibitions from like watching a video or going to conversations or reading similar passages that may also be in the museum but just not full?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think that's often like a kind of a critique a good mentor will use to push you as an exhibition developer. Like, why is this an exhibit and not a book? Like, why is this like not a really cool website? And I think that, as you're saying, like, it's really about the environment and it's about creating these kind of like social experiences. And I think what is powerful about museums is that they bring people together ideally from different walks of life. And again, I think as we just talked about, that's a place where museums really need to push themselves a little bit more. But I think it's yeah, that physical, like sharing physical space is, I think, what makes things different. I think that really came home to me in the pandemic because, you know, and I actually going to the Albany Bulb and seeing the work that Susan and Melody did with the exhibition there last year, I was like, oh, this is really valuable as a shared experience. It's also valuable to see this environment, like to have this really unique environment and to have a conversation about it. So I think that there is something about, like, it's the shared experience, and it's also like the physicality of either a place or a set of objects, or, you know, an artwork that's like large and can be kind of immersive. So I think, yeah, I think if I ever kind of doubted that, like this last 2 years has really helped me to be reminded of the value of sharing physical space. Yes?
I just realized, like, during the pandemic, this virtual museum tour grown.
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. I didn't answer your second half of your question.
Yeah. I just remember that, and I just wanted you to get you a take on about that. Like, do you see that continuing? I think there's a value to it. People I cannot be elsewhere, and while I'm physically here, kind of to spread out that information and the experience. Do you see that continuing? I don't know, the pandemic, and what is the value of the new experience?
I think that, you know, I guess I personally haven't super like felt like met by virtual museum experiences, and I feel like but I don't think that I think probably lots of people do get a lot of benefit from them, and I can imagine for really iconic museums like the Louvre, like the Smithsonian, like I can imagine that would be, they could have a lot of success with that because it's a kind of virtual trip to a very iconic place. I think there's an interesting opportunity to do both, like two ways of digital interaction. So I read about a program at the National Air and Space Museum where docents zoomed in. And so, you know, it allowed people who weren't, and they had like kind of a laptop on the floor, and they kind of just had a virtual Q&A. So you could come up and be like, tell us about the Gemini astronauts, and they would do that. So I think there's an opportunity for museums to bring sort of digital content into people's lives. And there's also an opportunity for people to digitally come to the museum as speakers and as facilitators and as experts. That's another kind of unexplored avenue, but actually that's the one I'm more excited about exploring. Like I'm more excited about bringing people to the museum to share like their perspective or ideas than about sort of trying to like replicate a museum environment in the digital space. That's just me though. Other people are going to feel differently about it.
Would it be worthwhile to pass this out anyway for you to talk through?
Yeah.
We have just a few minutes left.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I wasn't sure how much time we'd have or how much structure you guys would want in your class. So I did a sort of a interactive activity for you guys. I think it's always good to apply anything you're learning. And so the sort of idea behind this is to sort of do idea generation for an imaginary exhibit and just sort of get a feel for what that's like. So here is a worksheet I would have had you break into groups. And then I have an imaginary exhibition about the pandemic. We're going to take the future histories framing very, very literally here and have you guys make an exhibition about the pandemic as though you were doing it, 20 years in the future. You're documenting this oddball period in our history. And so then I would have you, if you want to, you certainly can, to kind of use the question prompts from the exhibition development portion of the presentation to generate exhibition ideas. And I have 5 main messages or 6 main messages. And then you kind of would each break into groups and work on one main message. And you'll probably ideally find that some main messages really lend themselves to certain types of interpretation. So for example, like the section or the main message about frontline workers or about how work functioned in the pandemic is one that might lend itself really well to sort of oral history, to first person accounts, to having people tell their own stories, whereas other things about like how do masks work might work better as an interactive. So those are some prompts that you could use to sort of develop an imaginary exhibition about the pandemic, should you want to.
Thank you so much, Sarah. We just have a couple minutes.